him would be a nice way of putting it. These are things, and one thing I like to say is appropriate is also kind of the fitness of it is described in this other statement whenever he says, sons, gather together that I may tell you what shall befall you in the last days. What's another word for telling somebody what's going to happen? Prophecy. Yeah, prophecy. So we're talking about the prophecies of what's going to happen to these sons. One of the things I think was interesting, last week we mentioned this, that in Hebrews chapter 11, it said the great work of faith of Jacob was the moment where he comes off the bed. And imagine this for a second. I don't know if this is meant to be one event, the end of the last chapter. If you were to jump back to chapter 47, you see how it is in verse 29 of chapter 47. We read Jacob, time to die has come, and he calls Joseph to him. And then chapter 48, it's Jacob's going to die, and Joseph's called to him. Maybe the same thing. In fact, I kind of think it is the same thing. I think it's just a restatement of that event, as Genesis does several times. So I'd like to connect all of this to say, imagine it like this. They call Joseph. Joseph, get your brothers, get everybody here. Your father's about to go. And he's on his bed, but he stands up. He puts his feet on the ground. You should think of that. It's kind of a neat thing. And he takes that staff of his. You know, that staff of his, that's been with him a while. You remember where he first, why that staff, or what journey that staff made with him? You know, when he first found God, that was all he had. Remember, the Bible said that when he left his father's home, all he had was his staff. And here he is at the end of his life, and you can, like I said, just imagine this man who's I just forgot how old he was, 130, 47? Okay. So here's a man approaching 150, older than anybody you know, and he comes off his bed, and that staff, and as he's there, and some of your Bibles say the headstead, and some say the staff. I think they're the same thing. And he takes a hold of that and he stands up. He says, I've got some things to do. So it starts off with Joseph. Now, kind of answered the question already that Barry's even mentioning here. The double inheritance of the firstborn. Do you remember how that went? Barry, you remember. How does the double inheritance of the firstborn go? What's the idea?
Well, I think, I don't quite know, but I think Jacob included grandchildren.
Yes.
He called all his sons,
yeah,
which we'll find out in 49. But here, he specifically calls Joseph
yeah.
his two sons.
Yeah.
And then he does something with those two that are a little different.
Barry, I'm actually a little confused with what goes on here a little bit, and I'll tell you all why here in a second. What is this, when you're the oldest son, like Esau was and lost it, the birthright or things like that, what was it you were supposed to get? What was it you were supposed to get, Teresa? A double portion. So like if you had two sons, you broke it up three ways, and one son got double. Now, why would you do that, Teresa? That sounds terribly unfair. I was the youngest, so I think it sounds extra unfair. But why would you do that? What would you be trying to do? What did you want to do? Let's say, the big Haynes estate, and, what do I want to do with the Haynes estate?
Well, they probably are going to become the patriarch of the family.
Yeah. Yeah, you want to create a name for that family, and you want to keep everything together. You don't want to break it all up. You want it all to come together. So like if you had a kingdom, you wouldn't want to break the kingdom up. You'd want your oldest to become the king or queen. You'd want that to be received like that. So you didn't want to break things up. That was one of the reasons that the oldest receives a double portion, so that you could keep everything together. It's still a practice. There's still lots of countries and societies where the oldest inherits the most because they want to keep it all in the family. They don't want to break it apart after all the work of bringing it together. Great, you have a comment? No. So to that end, here comes that double blessing. And who gets it? Who's supposed to get it? I should say. Who should have gotten it by the law? Reuben. Who gets it? Joseph. Now, this is kind of interesting. We're going to answer this as we walk through here, but tell me ahead of time if you already know the answer. Why? Why does Joseph get it? What do you think, George? Yeah, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi messed up. Now, what's going to be more important, a little confusing, is that number 4, who's number 4 of the sons? It's not Joseph, it's Judah. Judah's going to get something special. Judah's going to get, in fact, what Judah gets is better than what Joseph gets. Because Judah's going to get the promise. What's the promise? The seed promise. Very good. I'm glad you said it that way. The seed promise, the one that Jacob had gotten, the one that Isaac had gotten, the one that had been made to Abraham. That's going to come to Judah. But the double inheritance is going to go to Joseph. And why? Maybe this is easy. Why Joseph? What's the idea there? Go ahead.
I guess it's because his brother deceived his father.
That's true.
And that Joseph was killed by an animal, knowing by now, that he knows that they actually did sell Joseph into slavery.
What I think is interesting, what you're saying, Anthony, is that there in chapter 49, when he gives Joseph the own personal blessing, it reflects the idea that everybody was against you, but you stuck with God. So that's a neat point. Grant?
In addition to that, all the other brothers, did something wrong here. Joseph's also the one who kind of has taken the role of the preeminent son and saved all.
Yeah, that's right. And we saw that last couple of chapters, how Joseph is the one that's delivered them, and Joseph is the one that really has kind of taken the headship of the family in a lot of ways. Barry?
Well, we noticed that Joseph complained when Jacob put his hand over Ephraim.
Yeah.
He complained. Now, that's because his firstborn, could have got the inheritance, double inheritance. But what did Jacob say? This is God's will.
Yeah.
He says, let it be. This is God's will.
So this is what's interesting, what Barry's bringing up. So as you go through chapter 48 here, you see how it is that Joseph, he wants to give Joseph the double inheritance, the blessing. That's the double. I've got to find where he says it specifically. But he'll say in verse 19, no, that's not it. Verse 22, he says, I've given you one portion more above your brothers. But then he says something interesting about Joseph's sons. And I kind of am stuck. Here's what I don't understand. Is this what he's talking about, or is this in addition to? Because what does he do to Joseph's sons? What does he say? Hey, your boys, you know what they are now? They're my boys. They're my sons. Meaning that they would receive, the blessing of Israel. By the way, that amounts to later on them becoming what? Yeah, they're landed tribes of Israel. They're landed tribes of Israel. They're adopted landed tribes of Israel.
Even though Judah was special, Ephraim is the second greatest.
That's a great point.
Behind. So the sons that are receiving these blessings or land are below Ephraim, the son of Joseph.
Very interesting how this is all going to play out. Remember, this is prophecy. These are things that are going to happen over the next hundreds and hundreds of years, how these groups are going to play out. So he says, I'm going to adopt your two sons. Now, like I said, I'm not sure if giving him the double blessing meant I'm giving each of your sons a full share, or if he meant I'm giving each of your sons a full share, plus I'm giving you the double blessing. I don't know. And it could be either way. Sounds kind of like he's saying, I'm going to give you a double blessing and I'm going to take your sons. Either way, it's a big deal. Either way, this is a big thing. Except, like Barry said, something gets confused here. What is it? Barry said it. Yeah, it gets the wrong sons. It's the wrong sons. But he didn't. Why not? Barry said it already, actually. Why not? Because this was what God had planned. Why is this kind of ironic, Teresa? Yeah, because Jacob himself received the blessing that belonged to his brother, so to speak. And that was God's will too, ironically. But so it's kind of a great irony that this switch happens at this point. Anybody have any other thoughts about Jacob and this blessing? A whole chapter here. And I actually want to jump to the next chapter, but Monique, go ahead.
I just found it interesting that Joseph is also Rachel's firstborn, so it's Jacob's favorite wife.
Yeah. I wonder what that means. Kind of, by the way, a little interesting when we talk about Reuben next, some of that language of the firstborn, but, favorite wife, favorite son, and still a favorite son. And by the way, he's kind of the favorite son that kind of proved it. You're used to a favorite son blowing it, but this is the favorite son that kind of came through on that. And I think it's interesting that here at the end, Jacob has no problem still saying, Joseph's my favorite. And what are the brothers going to say? Well, he did save us. So, that's an interesting thing to think about what's happening here. So I want to talk about the blessings that come to these sons. By the way, 12 sons of Jacob, we say, but now you've seen how many tribes are coming out, or how many sons are there now? Now there's 13, 14. A little confusing. What is it elsewhere in the Bible, the 12 that's really 14 because 2 got added in later? Yeah, you ever think about that? The apostles are also the 12 that we add. I say added to. It depends if you see Barnabas as an apostle. But the idea is the apostle Paul later says, I was the apostle born out of due season. He says, I was unlike everybody else. So if you see Paul and Barnabas that way, or just Paul and Matthias, we have the 12 that aren't really 12. And it's kind of a neat parallel to how these things played out, how the apostles, how the tribes of Israel, and you get a little play with that in Revelation at the end of the book there with the 12 tribes and the 12 apostles and the language there. But it's kind of a neat parallel. Let's talk about the blessings here in chapter 49. Chapter 49 starts off, and like I said, he starts off by saying, here's what's going to happen. Here's your future. Here's where it's going. He starts off with Reuben. Kind of sad. He says, Reuben, you were the beginning of everything good for me. You were the beginning of my strength, and, the promises of God. You think about this. Listen to what he says. The excellency of dignity, the excellency of power. Reuben, you were all my hope. And you blew it. You betrayed me. Kind of interesting. One commentator said, that this last part of verse 4, that he switches the language to say, you did this, and then he says, he did this. So one commentator said, it's almost like he turns to his brothers and says, this is what he did, to make it clear to everybody. So it's interesting. Very first thing, here is Reuben, the guy that should have gotten it all, that should have been the blessed, and he's lost it. He's lost the blessing. Reuben's an important guy to think about. Of course, he was the one that didn't want to see Joseph get killed. That's important. But the point is, what he did was awful. Under the law of Moses, what would have happened? That's actually specifically mentioned as something you would be put to death for. So this was something pretty serious what Reuben had done, and it was unacceptable. So the blessing of Reuben, he says, Reuben, your blessing is that you're going to go through all this time a failure. He says, you're unstable, verse 4, and you will not excel. What's that mean? You won't excel. You're never going to. Go ahead, Gerald.
I was thinking not grow or not.
You're never going to make it. By the way, the tribe of Reuben, here's kind of a funny thing. Did they even get into the promised land? They didn't even get in the promised land because they stopped beforehand and took the land on the other side. And they were the ones that, like the Amorites and the Moabites, hit first. So they were always the ones getting torn up pretty bad. One point is made that from the tribe of Reuben, there's never a judge that comes up. There's never any important person that rises up. So Reuben never excels at anything throughout their history. He says, because of what you did, you're never going to excel. So that's a pretty hefty price that they're going to pay for. Next two, kind of interesting. The next two are lumped together. Simeon and Levi. Simeon and Levi. He says, Simeon and Levi, your brothers. And then he says, you guys are, this language kind of gives you a shiver. He says, you guys are instruments of cruelty. You're instruments of cruelty. He says, in their anger, they slew a man. In their self-will, they hamstrung an ox. What was it they did again? Can you remind me? What was it these two brothers did that Jacob was so upset about? Shechem. Yeah, they wiped out an entire city because one of the princes there had defiled their sister. They killed everybody. And Jacob's saying, this was because you guys are cruel. And I always thought this was interesting. Let not my soul enter their council. Let not my honor be united to their assembly. I was thinking, well, what is he saying here? I don't want to. These aren't the guys I'm ever going to have to ask for advice, so to speak. But there's also a sense he says, I don't want my honor going to them. So what we're getting here is a conversation of it's not going to be Reuben that gets the promise, and it's not going to be Simeon and Levi that get the promise. I don't want my honor with them either. Go ahead, Barry.
Yeah, and they were absorbed by Judah.
That's right.
They had a few cities given to them.
Yeah.
They were swallowed up as if they were nothing.
I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. What was the territory that the Levites got? What was their land section? Oh, they got the cities. Yeah, they got those, 42? Just forgot how many cities. I would say 42, but that may not be right. There were 6 sanctuary cities, and I want to say 42 cities total. That may not be right. But the point is, they didn't get territory, right? They didn't get territory. They're scattered out through Israel. But what about Simeon? The very first thing we read about in the book of Judges is that the tribe of Simeon said to Levi, to the tribe of Judah, why don't you come help us get our land? And they never had much after that. Because who took them over? Somebody said it already. I think Barry said it. What happened to the tribe of Simeon? Every map you have is kind of funny. When you look at your maps in the Old Testament, what do you see when you see the picture of Judah down at the bottom? Yeah, you see that little tiny thing of Simeon there. They were just swallowed up. They're gone. They're absorbed in, and they kind of disappear. So interestingly enough, later on, these two guys don't amount to anything. The Levi doesn't get an inheritance because they become the Levites. That's important, but it's also negative from this perspective. And Simeon just gets swallowed up in Judah. And so it's interesting that those two tribes are going to have this. So he's saying, not going to give it to Reuben because he betrayed you. Not going to give it to Simeon and Levi because they're bloodthirsty. So then who's next? Well, this is our important blessing. This is the big deal. This is one worth, if you like to mark up your Bible, this is a great place to mark up, especially verse 10. Judah. Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. You know what he's saying? Judah, you're the one. You're the one. Kind of default. First 3 didn't make it, but you're the one. You're going to get the blessings. Your hand is going to be on the neck of your enemies, and your father's children will bow down before you. Now, that's interesting because who had a dream that his father's children were going to bow down to him? Joseph did. But now here is Jacob saying, but Judah, it's going to be you. Now, not Judah, the person, of course. Judah, he says, the lion's whelp, or the lion. Later on, you get this lion of the tribe of Judah language. You know the answer to this. Who are we talking about? Jesus. I said verse 10 is just such a neat point. The scepter, what's a scepter? Scepter, he says in verse 10, shall not depart from Judah. What's a scepter? Yeah. Whenever King Charles got coronated, you see they gave him that weird looking baseball and a big staff, that staff is the scepter. It's the thing that the king holds that he has that says he's king. Yeah, authority. So he's saying, Judah, you'll have the authority and it's not going to leave you, interesting enough. And he says, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes. Until Shiloh comes. That's kind of a strange term. Shiloh. Shiloh is related to another word that we're familiar with. Shalom, Salem, Solomon. What do those words mean? Peace. They're all ways that the word peace. Some people see Shiloh more like a name, especially since it says to him, and the reference is to Shiloh, shall be the obedience of the people. So he says, here is where the king is coming. This is the promise. The seed promise, George said earlier. The seed promise is going to come to Judah. Judah's our God. Judah's the one where this seed promise is going to go. The other brothers aren't going to get it. Judah's going to get it. Joseph's not going to get it. It's going to be Judah. It's going to be the tribe of Judah. And Judah is the one that has these things. And I think what's interesting about Judah is that we saw, as we talked about it, a great many changes in Judah. How Judah lost a lot and gained humility, perhaps. but now it's said that it's going to be him that the king comes. Anybody have a comment or thought about that as we think about this? Anybody want to throw something at that? Like I said, Judah's a neat promise. It's a great promise. So let's go on. Let's go on. Next person on the line is pretty small, promise-wise, and that's verse 13, Zebulun. Zebulun shall dwell by the sea. He'll become a haven of ships, and his border shall adjoin Sidon. That's a pretty unsophisticated promise. He's just saying he's going to be a man of the sea. His tribe is going to be there. Some people see this kind of as just a generic, this is going to be the blessing Israel will have in general. So there's not a lot of substance here to the promise of Zebulun. Grant?
On the other hand, if I'd been Zebulon and seen 3 out of the 4 brothers, I'd been pretty happy with what I got.
Yeah, that's right, because the first 3 really got dinged, didn't they? Yeah, that's true. I actually hadn't thought of it that way. That's a great point. So Zebulun has his promise. Issachar. Issachar is an interesting one. Issachar is strong. He's the strong donkey. By the way, we think of donkey as an insult, but a donkey is, in those days, what? Yeah, beast of burden. I don't know what would we say today. Boy, it's a nice Dodge Ram or, Ford F-250. He's a Ford F-250. But you know what? He's got no gas. That's what he says. He says he's a strong donkey, but he lies down between burdens. He sees rest is good, the land's pleasant. He puts down his burden. What happens? He becomes slave. It was kind of interesting, Issachar. We don't really know much about. They kind of vanish over. So this is a prophecy that the fulfillment of it is just kind of implied throughout time. That these are people that had a lot of strength, but they never did anything with it. Sounds like a proverb, right? The strong person that doesn't do any work is going to fail, and the weak person that does a lot of work will succeed. And that seems to be kind of the thought here. So I thought that was an interesting one. The next one comes to Dan. Dan's interesting, by the way. Dan, later in the Old Testament, and even in the New Testament, is a byword for what kind of people? That's kind of a tough question. I'm going to give you a Brian point if you know. Later in the Old Testament, and then in the New Testament, like in the book of Revelation, they don't even talk about, when they go through a list of tribes, they don't even mention Dan, because Dan is the word or the idea of what kind of people? Lawyers? Wow. Servant viper. That's nice. He says, Dan, you're a serpent to the people. What does the tribe of Dan do? Well, for one thing, I'll pause there before we go into it. Dan is a judge of the people as the tribes of Israel. By the way, who's our great judge from Dan? One of the greatest of judges. Maybe. Somebody said it. Samson's the one. Samson comes from the tribe of Dan. So some people see this as perhaps a reference to Samson. Hey, you guys are going to have one of the greatest judges ever. You're going to be a judge of the people, but you're also a snake. Kind of interesting things about snakes. You're walking around, you don't know they're there until they've got you, and when they've got you, they've got you. What is it in the book of Judges that the tribe of Dan does that the Bible constantly says, oh, is awful? You remember?
I'm not sure. I don't think so, but wasn't one of Israel's altars there?
Yes. So Israel builds the idol in Dan that in the book of Judges it says that the tribe of Dan intentionally set up. It intentionally set it up. Dan becomes the name for idolatry. And all throughout the rest of the Old Testament, when the prophets would talk in symbolism and they'd say, hey, don't be Dan, what they mean is don't be an idolater. Because the tribe of Dan, early on in their time, I think it's around Judges chapter 18, they were like, hey, our place is too small. So they moved way up north to another territory. And up in that area, there was a well-known idol, and they just took it over. And while they're on the way, they grab a priest, and they say, why don't you be the priest for our place? And they take him up there, and they set up this idolatrous house that for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years then becomes the snare of Israel. So that at the time of the kings of Israel, when they're saying, and when Jeroboam says, I want to set up a place of worship, he says, and Dan's already got it made. Dan is the snare of Israel. Dan is the thing that's the serpent and the snake in the grass. That tribe is going to devour these people. In their idolatry. So Dan's an interesting one to think about. It goes on to Gad. The very name Gad means like a troop of soldiers or a band of soldiers. And so it's kind of a play. He said, Dan, a troop will trample on him, but he'll triumph in the end. Some people think maybe this is like in the time of David, the Gadites came out and they rose up a small army to go against Saul and join David. And they think, well, maybe that could be it. Kind of an interesting, a little blessing. Another one that's a real small one, verse 20, Asher is going to be rich. Bread is going to be rich. They'll yield royal dainties. Some people point to Solomon drawing his bread from this location, from this tribe. So that might be the fulfillment of that. We get another one with Naphtali, another small one. He runs like a deer, and he uses beautiful words. Well, Dad, what kind of blessing was that? I might have asked, because it seems pretty inconsequential. It's just a statement, perhaps. And then we come to Joseph. Now, this is the blessing that Joseph receives. And it's interesting because he describes Joseph. He says, Joseph, you're a branch, a fruitful bough on a wall. You're growing up there. He says, but these archers went against you. Who are the archers that went against him? His brothers, later on the Egyptians. Everybody was against you, but your bow remained in strength. Your arm was strong. Who made his arm strong, Jacob says? Yeah. He'll call God 5 different things in these blessings. One of the interesting ones here, he says, the mighty God of Jacob, the shepherd, the stone of Israel, the Almighty. So he has all these different words here, and 4 of them he's using right here. He's the one that helps you, that brought you these blessings, that brought you the blessings of your children, and all the things that are going to be. So he gives Joseph this very elaborate, beautiful blessing of the things that he's going to receive, the good things that he's going to have. Joseph is going to become that blessing. Now, that being said, talking about Ephraim and Manasseh, his 2 sons, we jump back a second to the last chapter where he talks about Ephraim and Manasseh, and it's already been mentioned that Ephraim is promised to be great. Ephraim is promised to be great. Now, Ephraim is interesting because Ephraim becomes one of the largest tribes. In fact, towards the latter half of the kingdom period, sometimes when the prophets would talk about Israel, they would just call Israel Ephraim. Oh boy, that doesn't get confusing sometimes. I know a lot of things do. But they would just call the whole tribes, all the tribes of the north, they would just call them Ephraim. Manasseh was over on the other side. They were just north of Reuben, and they lost their tribe pretty early on. They didn't succeed very well. But Ephraim becomes really powerful. We have a lot of people that rose up from there and led from there, but also at the same time, they weren't always known as the most righteous group either. So these 2 sons that Joseph has that become sons to Jacob, they also receive their blessings, but their blessings both speak to their power, but also perhaps their failure as well. And here comes the blessings of Jacob. One of the things that's kind of interesting here is that he talks about these blessings, and he says, these will be, verse 26, the blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestors. What is he saying? What is Jacob describing here when he says, going to verse 26 of chapter 49, as he's blessing Joseph again? I kind of jumped back there. I apologize to jump around too much. But when he says, the blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestors, what is he describing? What kind of things is he saying here? You might say, what does a father want for his kids? He'd say, well, I want them to do better than I did, right? And so he says, you know what? I excelled better than my ancestors. He says, the blessing of your father, me, have excelled the blessings of my ancestors. He says, I'm better off than Isaac or Abraham. How is he better off than Abraham? What's the one big blessing that he has a lot more of than Abraham? Children, sons, yeah. Sons of promise, you might even say, because they're all, in a way, sons of promise. So yeah, he has a lot more. One of his sons, Prime Minister of Egypt. That's pretty good. So he says, you are the blessing of your father. You are my great blessing. And he says, these blessings are yours. He says they'll fall on the head of Joseph. Fall on the head of Joseph. Now, after this, we don't really talk about a tribe of Joseph. Instead, we just talk about his 2 sons as their own tribes. So it's kind of interesting that he's giving his son this promise, But the idea is it kind of ends here. In other words, there's no mention of it going on past this time, but instead it kind of ends here. Anybody have a thought about that? Why might the promises of this powerful blessing, why might not there be a tribe of Joseph coming along later? What do you think?
Well, he's not going to be alive when he leaves.
Right.
And
One thing I want to say is that while the blessings to the brothers speak to things that are far off, what he's talking to Joseph seems to be right then. And I think that that's the big idea. You said he's not going to be there later. I think it kind of points to the idea that what we're talking about with Joseph are the things that Joseph's going to see in his life. Joseph, he says, you're going to have a great life. You know, things are going to go really well for you. You're going to do really well. You're going to do fantastic. And so he brings him this blessing, but there isn't really a tribe like that. Go ahead, Greg.
It seems interesting that Jacob was the one that passed his blessing on to Ephraim and Manasseh. So usually it wouldn't go Jacob, Joseph.
Yeah.
Bypass Joseph. So perhaps maybe the sense was that Joseph had already been blessed.
And again, a lot of times people look at it and say, well, Joseph gets two tribes instead of a tribe of Joseph. So some people see it that way too. By the way, a little bit confusing. You know, in the book of Revelation, it talks about a tribe of Joseph. And it's only there just to kind of round off some numbers so they can drop out Dan and a couple of others to give us 12 tribes. So that's a little bit confusing later on. But, I think it's a great observation and probably as good an answer as we have as why Joseph is getting this blessing. So let's go to the last one. Last one's an interesting guy. Benjamin, sweet Benjamin, right? Sweet Benjamin, the vicious, ravenous wolf. I said last time, one of the things that was interesting about Benjamin, I hadn't noticed before till we were last week's study, was that Benjamin already has a lot of sons. He has more sons than the rest of his brothers, and I thought that was kind of interesting. But he says, Benjamin, you're a ravenous wolf. And in the morning, you tear apart the prey. What? Sweet Benjamin? Tell me what's going to happen here with Benjamin. What's Benjamin going to do? It's in the book of Judges. We see this. Benjamin, what does happens in the end in the book of Judges to the tribe of Benjamin? Anybody remember this?
He goes against all the other tribes.
Yeah! That tribe declares a war against all the other tribes. Who wins? Kind of obvious, right? 1 against 11. The other tribes wipe them out. Benjamin becomes the smallest of the tribes. It becomes the weakest of the tribes. But here's what's interesting. It's not like, I said before, like Reuben, nobody of prominence came out of that. Who are some of the people that came out of the tribe of Benjamin that were pretty significant? Who's our important king? King Saul. King Saul. Tasha, you're going to say Saul? Yeah. King Saul comes out of there. That's actually pretty prominent. To come out of there. I kind of wondered about this, though. He says, in the morning you're going to devour the prey, but at night you get to divide the spoil. Now, at first I thought, well, he's just saying you're really a vicious guy, you're a fighter, and that's going to come out. But, it occurred to me, one commentator said, well, wait a second, it kind of sounds like he's saying, but wait, in the end, Benjamin's going to get a part of the spoil. And I thought, well, what could that mean? Especially since, what happened to the line of Saul? Over time, after Saul came, but it got wiped out. It was broken apart because of the house of Saul. But wait a second, there's another Benjaminite that's prominent in the Bible,
Saul.
And his name is Saul. And he says, I'm the least of tribes, the least of the apostles. And one commentator said, you think he could be talking about Paul of Tarsus? As being the guy that in the end gets to divide the spoil? He gets to be one of the men that preaches the gospel? Well, that'd be interesting if that's what he's saying. I don't know. It's kind of a neat thought. And these are the blessings of the sons. Oops, that's not supposed to be there. These are the blessings of the sons. Go ahead, Grant.
I had a question. I was trying to find it out, but I couldn't see. Did Joseph have any other sons after Ephraim?
So interesting enough, if you remember in the last chapter, he said he does, but we don't have any names of any subsequent sons. He says you're going to have other sons, but he doesn't mention their names. They're not listed here later on. And in the genealogies, they only give the genealogies of the tribes, which is kind of where does the descendants of Joseph go? And I don't know. So there is a big question mark there. Anybody have a better answer, by the way? I give you 2 brine points if you stump the chump. Okay. So the point is, though, we really just don't know the answer. So here's Joseph, or here is Jacob. And Jacob has gotten on his bed, and he charges all of them. He says to every one of them, this is verse 29 of chapter 49, I'm about to go. And he says, I need you to bury me with my fathers in the cave of Ephron the Hittite. Now, we remember this story because this was where Abraham had bought the cave, belonged to Machpelah. He bought the cave that he buried Sarah in. He was buried in it. Isaac was buried there with Rebekah. Who else is buried there? Leah. We kind of said that's interesting, Leah and not Rachel. Go ahead. Yeah. Rachel's buried in Bethlehem. It says earlier, so Rachel's not even buried there. Now, by the way, Teresa, I won't make you answer this, but it makes me kind of think, what does that tell you about Leah? One of those things I told you why I like Leah. Yeah, I kind of think she's the progenitor. She half the tribe of Israel is her descendants. She's the progenitor, but she also seemed to be the more godly one. And being buried in this cave is a big deal. Why is it a big deal? I mean, I said this last week. The Egyptians are the best people in the world for burying people. They build the best monuments. We still got those monuments. We don't even know where the cave of Machpelah is, but we still got the Egyptian monuments. But why is it important to be buried there? Why does Jacob say, I need to be buried back there? I need you to get me in a cart and take me all the way back. It's the land of promise. Mentioned this before, that maybe there's a sense too, the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews chapter 11 that all these guys, these patriarchs, they're looking ahead. But they're not looking ahead just to the promised land. They're looking ahead to the resurrection. And there's a connection here in this way of, and not saying you had to be buried in that cave, but the idea that he's thinking about what's next. He's thinking about what's going to happen next. Verse 33, Jacob finishes all this. Remember where he was? He got up out of the bed, stood there. What does it say he did? Sits back down, picks his feet back up, curls under him, and he dies. That's dramatic. You don't see that with Isaac, and you don't see that with Abraham. And as I said, again, maybe now we get why the Hebrew writer said, oh, you want to talk about faith? Let's talk about Jacob in this last moment and blessing his sons and how he gets off his bed and he's got the staff and he goes through these blessings and he prophesies the future and he talks about the coming of the Messiah and all these incredible things are going to happen, sits back down, draws his feet up, and he dies. Just like that. It really is a remarkable thing that we bring ourselves to here. He breathed his last and he's gathered to his people. And that brings us to an end. Anybody have any final comments or thoughts you want to throw out there as we wrap up? We're just about a minute or two early, so I'd love a comment if you got one. Please, Michael. Yeah? That's a great question. Boy, I love questions like this. So we're not 100% sure. What we use to date these periods are things like, when was the city of Ur a big deal? That's around 1900 BC, so about 4,000 years ago. So a lot of times we say, well, we can kind of peg down that Abraham was about 4,000 years ago. Between the generations as they're moving along, we see about 150, 250 years passing. So we typically put this somewhere between, let's say, 1800 and as late as 1600 BC. Now, why it matters is in the book of Exodus, the big stumper for everybody is, who is Pharaoh? We know who the Egyptian kings were, but it never tells us his name. So we're always wondering which Pharaoh is our Pharaoh and exactly when was all of this happening. So there's a lot of questions about this. Now, a few weeks ago, we mentioned that during this time, there was an enormous famine all over the world. And we kind of used that a little bit to help us too. We think maybe it had something to do with some eruptions in the Mediterranean. So maybe this is around, like I said, 1700, 1650 BC is when these things are happening. That's our best guess. But truly, we don't have anything we can really pin down to get a good date because, frankly, before 1000 BC, we don't know anything about dates. And I don't mean we as Christians or Bible scholars. I mean, even historians, they're just guessing. everything before 1000 BC, they're just guessing at. Don't let them tell you otherwise. They really don't know. Grant, you were going to make. Oh no, you sure? Because I got another 30 seconds to fill out.
I was going to say if Michael was asking maybe more about also, in terms of what's going on in Genesis, I noticed that since Jacob said he was 130 when he met Pharaoh, that means he's been 17 years living here before he dies.
So you mean for the last 17 years he'd been there?
So I don't know, maybe that he might have also been wondering about the time in relation to what's going on.
Oh, okay. So 17 years had passed in that time. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. So that brings us to a close here. Last week is our last week, Genesis chapter 50. We're going to do a little bit of overview, kind of remind ourselves all the things we've talked about, why the book of Genesis matters so much to us, why it's such an important book to study. Thanks for all the thoughts and comments tonight. Traveling for work. Okay.
Just there. Just there.
She was unexpected. Brian was about to call yesterday. We got it worked out. I know the rapid call. I got another microphone. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. If you'd like to grab your songbooks and go ahead and mark them to song number 320. Sing song number 320 after the invitation tonight. Then after you've marked that, you'd like to grab your supplemental songbooks and turn to song number 110. Song number 110, I Will Call Upon the Lord. Go ahead and sing all three verses of this song, and if you feel up to it, let's stand as we sing. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from my enemies. The Lord liveth, and blessed be the rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted. The Lord liveth, and blessed be the rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted. I will look upon the Lord. He is all my righteousness. He will make his face to shine on me. The Lord liveth, and blessed be the rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted. The Lord liveth, and blessed be the rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted. I will wait upon the Lord. He will fill me with new strength. I will fly with wings like an eagle. The Lord liveth, and blessed be the rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted. The Lord liveth, and blessed be the rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted. I will call upon the Lord, the Lord. Please be seated. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. In Matthew, verse 13, Matthew chapter 13, starting in verse 3, Jesus says this. As he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, Behold, the sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell beside the road, and the birds came and ate them up. Others fell on the rocky places, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprung up, because they had no depth of soil. And when the sun has risen, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. Others fell among the thorns, and the thorns came up and choked them out. And others fell on the good soil, and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears, let him hear. The question is, of these four soils, which one are you? Now, there's people that's going to say, well, I'm not one of these, not one of these four. I don't believe in Christianity. I don't believe in the Bible. I believe in something else, maybe like another religion, like Islam or Buddhist. I don't belong in this category. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 6, 1 Corinthians 8 verse 6, it says, Yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all are things, and we exist for him, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, from whom all things, and we exist through him. And also in Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 5, says, One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, and through all, and in all. The first seed is the person who hears the word, but does not understand it, nor does anything about it. These are the people who respond to this by asking, what about the person who never hears the word? What about them? Romans chapter 1 verse 20, it says, For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature has been clearly seen, being understood that which has been made, so they are without excuse. Everyone who gets that opportunity to learn God's truth, everybody will get that opportunity. Are you the second? The seed on the rocky soil. A person who hears the word receives it with joy, but when affliction, like loss of job, or a loved one gets sick, or persecution from family or friends, because of the word, you decide that the gospel wasn't for you. Matthew 5 and verse 45, Matthew 5:45, it says, So that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven, for he causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Or what about Luke chapter 18? starting in verse 29. Luke 18, starting in verse 29. And it says to them, truly I say to you, there is one who has left house or wife or brothers or parents or children for the sake of the kingdom of God, who will not receive many times as much at this time, and in the age to come, eternal life. Or maybe you might be the third seed among the thorns. A person who hears the word, but the words of the world or the wealth and riches make you unfruitful or unfaithful. Matthew 6, starting in verse 24, it says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. For this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Last, are you the fourth seed? On the good soil, the man who hears the word, understands it, and bears much fruit. Every one of us is one of these four seeds. But there is a problem. Of the four seeds, there is only one seed that would end up with God. This is the fourth seed. The other seeds will only lead you to the evil one, into destruction. So what seed are you? If you are not the fourth seed, don't give up. You can also become a seed sown on the good soil. But you need to take the steps for salvation. You need to hear the word. You need to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Confess that he is the Christ. Repent of your sins and be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. It is all up to you. If you are ready to take these steps and a seed sown on good soil yielding a crop, then come forward. Or if you're a Christian and has not been living the standards set in the Bible, and you want the prayers of the congregation, then please come forward as we stand and sing the invitation song.
When Jesus comes to reward his servants, whether it be noon or night, faithful to him will he find us watching, with our lamps all trimmed and bright. Oh, can we say we are ready, brother, ready for the soul's bright home? Say, will he find you and me still watching, waiting when the Lord shall come? If at the dawn of the early morning he shall call us one by one, when to the Lord we restore our talents, will he answer thee, well done? Oh, can we say we are ready, brother, ready for the soul's bright home? Say, will he find you and me still watching, waiting when the Lord shall come? Blessed are those whom the Lord finds watching, in his glory they shall share. If he shall come at the dawn or midnight, will he find us watching there? Oh, can we say we are ready, brother, ready for the soul's bright home? Say, will he find you and me still waiting, waiting when the Lord shall come. Be seated.
Before we dismiss in a word of prayer, I got some announcements. Sick tonight. Tom's still sick.